Speak in English. I don't know Italian, but thank you very much to Vittorio and Lorenzo for inviting me in. Thank you for coming. It's great to see people here. I do have a strange accent, so feel free to ask questions for translations or to slow down at any time. If you don't understand a word or phrase, speak up, yeah? Because I know my accent sounds strange to many Europeans. So people can understand so far?
Yeah.
Okay. But please do ask if it's going too fast to say slow down or repeat the phrase. So it's great to be here from the other side of the world. So what I'm going to talk about today is the meat processing industry in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa is the Maori or indigenous name for New Zealand. It means land of the long white cloud because it's always cloudy in New Zealand. I'll explain where New Zealand is, so don't worry about that. But I do want to first of all talk about the broader picture, the global picture before going into New Zealand, so, and a bit of theory before looking at the particulars. Yeah. So to put informal resistance in context, so when we look at labour history and labour relations between workers and bosses, or workers and employers, it's really important that we look beyond strikes, which is normally what we associate with formal resistance. There's other forms of resistance that are called informal, sometimes everyday resistance, which are just as important. So we need to examine both. Most labour historians only look at strikes, which is overt, conspicuous, rather than the hidden or the subterranean. So what I'm going to do today is look at the more hidden history and bring it to life. So informal resistance is important today, very important today, for two main reasons. One main reason is it is probably the main form of workers' resistance in wealthy countries around the world at the moment. Because strikes, as you well know, have gone like this. There's far fewer strikes. You know this in Italy. In the 1970s in Italy there was many, many strikes. It's gone down, since, and there's far less today. Is that right? Yeah.
There's a general impression.
Yeah, and so often workers, when they have to resist, they have to do it informally today. Under more conditions of neoliberalism, often you have to resist by everyday informal methods, if that makes sense. That's one reason why, and the other reason was in the 1970s, way back in the past, which is the year in the 1980s, the time I'm looking at, there was an awful lot more, there was much more informal resistance, I think. So it's important to look at resistance historically, so even though there were more strikes in the 1970s, there was also more informal resistance, I believe, at the same time, and they were intertwined. That's kind of my thesis, that formal flowed into formal and vice versa. If that makes sense. Do people follow? Am I speaking too fast? It's okay? Please do say. You can. Yeah, so my kind of thesis, my argument is, and I'll repeat this soon, is that I want to question the dominant interpretation of informal resistance that has happened since the 1980s. And I'll read out a quote. This is from a British historian called Richard Price. He was writing in 1986. And he says that...
perhaps you can write the name...
Richard Price, yeah.
No?
Yeah? Do you have a...
pen?
Yes, there. On the paper here?
Yes.
Okay, that's Richard. So that's his name. This is in a British history, probably in English. And he said that the informal resistance possessed a limited scope. They were apolitical. Do you know what that means? Apolitical, not political. Did not contradict the real subordination to capitalist domination, and finally, did not signify the uniquely militant property of the rank and file. So he's basically saying there's not much to see in informal resistance. He's saying that it's not very radical. And I think this is the dominant interpretation of informal resistance since the 1980s. And I want to question that by looking at New Zealand. So this is based on an article I just published in an American journal called Labour and Society. Okay, so first of all, I'll explain what informal resistance is, if that's okay. Very quickly, so you can make a distinction between informal and formal. I think I've already talked about that, and covert and overt, if that makes sense. Overground and underground, yeah? And so informal resistance is sort of more underground. And one prominent example of that is when people, it's what's called time appropriation. So they take time for themselves during company time, during work time, to do their own activities. So this is, you avoid work, you don't work, you go slow. You've heard of absenteeism. You don't come to work at all. So you work slowly. A prominent example today is what's called cyber slacking. Have you heard of this? So this is when you surf the internet during work time for your own ends. So kind
call
of
this practice?
cyber slacking.
Cyber slacking.
Cyber slacking. So you're slacking off, meaning not working during.
Just pretending.
Yeah. And you can see this with many students today. They're on their phones or computers. Yeah. And another form of appropriation, of course, is you steal. So you appropriate the product, not just time. So you steal from where you work. Theft. Another prominent form of sabotage, when you break the production. And another form, which is more controversial, but I think is really important, is wildcat strikes. Do you have that term in Italian, wildcat?
Shopping selvaggi. Wildcat.
Yeah. So these are on the boundary between informal and formal, because there is a boundary, and it's sort of a grey area in between. So it's when workers informally organise on the shop floor, on the factory floor, on the office floor, between themselves, with their friends. They go out and strike, and then the rest of the workers follow, and then it becomes open. So it's sort of like on the boundary between informal and formal. But I put it in informal resistance because it's largely informally organised on the shop floor, if that makes sense. Even though, so sometimes what is hidden and subterranean becomes open and overground, if you know what I mean. And that wildcat strikes are a great example of that. And then there's this whole range of studies at the moment called misbehaviour, which is basically defined as anything you do at work that you're not supposed to do. And so there's a whole range of studies at the moment looking at all different forms of misbehaviour at work, which can range from very subtle forms like just being cynical towards the boss, towards more open forms of resistance. But I won't go into that. So that's what informal resistance is. So any questions? All good so far? Okay. So I'm not going to set the scene in the 1970s. I wanted to talk about the 1970s globally. So what happened in the 1970s was there was a strike wave around the world, particularly in high-income countries. And this strike wave was unusual. So just to throw a question to you, Italy was had the second highest number of strikes in the world in the 1970s. Can anybody guess which country had more strikes? It's a European country.
Europe.
Yeah. So Italy is normally thought of like as the heartland of strikes in the 70s. No. They were actually down in the middle. You don't know? No, Germany is down at the bottom. No, Britain's below Italy, yeah, well below Italy.
It's Spain.
No. Italy's above Spain. It's an unusual country, you'd never guess it.
Well, tell us something.
It's on the fringes of Europe. It's a wealthy country. It's close to America, North America. No?
Great Britain?
No, further. It's Scandinavian country. No? Anybody guess?
Like Sweden?
But Europe country?
Sorry?
Or not? Europe country or?
Yeah, European, yeah.
Yeah, European countries.
Iceland.
Yeah, Iceland. Iceland had the most number of strikes. But yeah, so there was a global strike wave, and things, really peaked, particularly in places like Italy and Iceland, Spain, UK, USA. New Zealand was in the middle, so it wasn't a really. We didn't have an explosive strike wave, but we had a large one by our standards. So what's unusual about this strike wave? I think that first of all, it's driven from below. Often, not always. Driven from below means that it's from the workers themselves rather than from union organisers. So it's coming from the shop floor, from the factory floor, if that makes sense. Or that it's intermixed with strikes organised from above, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Like you're going to strikes organised from below, from the shop floor, and you're going to strikes organised from above by organisers. Does that make sense? So a lot of it comes from below. So workers were very annoyed, and also informal resistance played a big part in it, in the strike wave. Yeah? It was quite a novel thing, a new thing. Yeah? And so there was a lot of theories came out about it at the time because of something new. So I'll go into those theories now, and you'll know some of them because one tradition comes from Italy, of course. And so I'm first of all going to look at some some unorthodox Marxist interpretations. Thank you. Unorthodox Marxist interpretations of this informal resistance. And so what these Marxist theories are saying, because they're unorthodox, they're not from the more orthodox traditions of Marxism, that informal resistance actually reveals something quite radical. The possibility of a new communist society is being revealed through workers organising themselves, right? Beyond the unions. So this is quite controversial. This is not your normal Marxism. So they see workers are going beyond the unions and organising themselves, right? And so the first tendency I'm going to look at is called the Johnson-Forrest tendency. Has anybody heard of that before? It's from the United States. So it comes out of just straight after World War II, and it's around a figure called C.L.R. James. Shall I write that? So he's from... Sorry?
Caribbean.
Yeah, from the Caribbean. He's from Trinidad. So he's a black writer who moves to the United States, and it comes out of the Trotskyist milieu, and then they sort of reject Trotskyism, and they form this tendency called the Johnson-Forrest tendency, and he's one of the main figures in that. And so what this tendency says is that when workers try to humanise work through informal resistance, they try and humanise it, make it easier, make it more social, make it more fun, by humanising work, by making it less alienating, that they are trying to informally control the work process, informally control work. So they believe that it allows for informal self-management, autogestion, yeah? So workers are actually controlling the work themselves. And this raises the possibility of a society built on workers' self-management. So that's their kind of theory. So it's an informal control of the work. Does that make sense? So this, rather than bosses controlling it, rather than capitalist social relations, workers are creating new relations at work that prefigure a new society. Does this make sense? Yeah. And of course the second so I've got a couple of books in there. Maybe I'll ignore that. But this was very influential. And then they did a lot of studies of resistance on the shop floor. Like they're called, in Italy they were called inquiries, yeah? Workers' inquiries. You heard of the term? So this is the idea, you go into the workplace and you find out what workers are actually doing. Of course this is associated with which tradition? You guys all know this? The Italian tradition of, do you want to say it out loud?
Richiesta operaia? Sì, richiesta operaia. You mean the name? Or?
Yeah, the tradition. You guys, autonomous Marxism is called in Italy.
L'autonomia.
Yeah.
Dell'inchiesta operaia era al centro del progetto
dell'autonomia. So, operaismo, the first. So in the 1950s to 1960s, they go into the Italian factories and find out what is going on in Fiat and so on. And what they find is something different. Initially they find similar to the Johnson-Forrest tendency, that there's a formal control of work. But then they find a different tendency amongst workers, and this is the refusal of work. So workers are actually refusing work. They don't want to control the work process. They want to escape from it. They want autonomy from work. And of course this prefigures to them a communist society where there's no more working class. The working class abolishes itself. Do you know what I mean? No classes, right? And no forced work. So people want to escape this forced work of under capitalism. So you've heard of the slogan "more money for less work" from the autonomous? Yeah. So this is how they sort of sloganized what workers were doing. And I've got of course a quote from Antonio Negri. Is that how you say it? Negri? Yes. So you should correct my pronunciation. So he's basically saying that workers were fleeing the factory through wildcat strikes, absenteeism, and other forms of work refusal. And this represented to him workers asserting their own needs and use values over and above the demands of capital. So sort of bringing use value Marxist theory into it. So it's sort of like a rejection of work. And workers are sort of subordinating sort of capitalist work process, if that makes sense. Okay, so these radical theories were prominent in the 1960s and 1970s, and they were picked up by other people. They're published in many journals and so forth. And then there's a reaction against them later on when things turn. So I'll go into the 1980s to look at the more pessimistic time. So the 70s, I think, was an optimistic time on the left, when many thought there was a possibility for rapid change, right? In the 1980s, you have a reaction against struggle, and you have a crisis. In comes neoliberalism, restructuring, factories close, etc., and people become more pessimistic. And these are reflected in the theories at the time. And so one big theory that comes in, of course, in the 1970s is called labour process theory. Have you heard of that? No? This is an American theory. It comes from Harry Braverman. Yeah? And he basically looks at the labour process and how it works. But they basically say that when you look at everyday resistance, there's not much going on. So what workers actually do is they actually reinforce capital. They're not being subversive. And so there's a famous study by an American called Michael Burrowoy in 1979 called Manufacturing Consent. This is before Noam Chomsky, the same title as Noam Chomsky had later. But so workers actually, through shop floor games, sped up production. This is what he found. So they actually, through their games, they work faster. So they're not actually being subversive. Does it make sense? Yep. So this is like almost the opposite of the autonomist, yeah? And then another strand, of course, comes in, and I think this is the dominant one in the literature I've read to this day, and that is post-structuralism comes in. Another pessimistic theory, I believe. I'm not a post-structuralist, I should state straight away, but what the post-structuralists say is they react against both the autonomists, both the optimists and labour process theorists, and they say that there is no authentic rebellious worker like the autonomists sometimes claim. They're authentic, like authentically rebellious worker that wants to rebel, that we are all complex mixture of different things and we're contradictory. So that's their main finding, is that we're a complex mixture of resistance and submission to bosses, to the rhythms of capital. Does that make sense?
What do you mean for post-structuralist? You said Foucault. What do you mean with that?
They're just bringing on the broader tradition. They don't actually mention Foucault. But the authors I've read are not very well known. And they don't really draw upon theory much.
Okay.
But they talk about deconstruction and that things,
because it's a great family.
Yeah, it's a huge family.
To know what post-structuralism means.
Yeah, exactly. This is the problem. So I think these theories are both these theories are really important, but I think they both have shortcomings, and this is why I want to question them. So the first thing I want to question about labour process theory is that it neglects agency. So it overlooks what workers can do on the shop floor. It just looks at the broader structures. So I think you need structure and agency combining. You know, like Marx said, that workers make history, but are not in circumstances of their own choosing. You know, so people can change things, but it's never in circumstances of their own choosing. So there's a dialectic between structure and agency, if that makes sense. So that's my first point. But I do think examining structures is really important, because they do shape things and limit possibilities, you know. And the problem with the pro-structuralists, even though I do agree that there's a mixture of submission and resistance. I think that's a really important point, that things are really complex, so that they have this, I think they add a lot to the theory about, you know, resistance. You know, it is really complex, but often it's based on what I would call sort of a ahistorical method. So that means that they just look at resistance as being a constant over time, right? It never changes. But if you actually examine history, resistance goes up and down. You know, it goes in cycles or waves. You know, like this. You know, it can go lower and, you know, ups and downs. It's I think there's a sort of rhythm, even though you can never tell when and where the rhythm changes. You know, it's because I don't believe in sort of strong determinism. I believe, you know, you can't just say that resistance is a sort of constant level like post-structuralists do, because they sort of base their studies on micro studies, right? So they just look at tiny little factories or offices, and they don't look at the bigger picture. They don't look at the broader context and the historical context. So I think it's really important to place our studies of work and of labour in a broader historical, social, cultural context, yeah? So that would be my critique of sort of post-structuralist approaches. So that's where I'm coming from, and this is what I'm going to argue in New Zealand, if this makes sense. Good. So that's my brief theory. So I'll go into New Zealand now. How shall I say this? Okay, so first of all, I'll show you a slide. Where is New Zealand? So New Zealand's in the South Pacific. This is in relation to the antipodes. When you reverse the longitude and latitude of New Zealand, you come out in Spain. So this is the actual size of New Zealand there. So it's quite larger than people think. And so you come out in Spain and Portugal if you reverse. If you drill a hole down in Spain, you'll come out in New Zealand eventually, if that makes sense. So it's a bigger country than people think. But the major difference is that there aren't many people. So there's only 4.5 million people in New Zealand. So New Zealand was colonised by the British in 1840, so very recently. It originally had Maori inhabitants who are from Polynesia, Polynesian descent. So Maori were forcibly, the land was taken off them. There was war that went on for about 30 years. Maori resisted quite successfully to the British invasion, but eventually they succumbed, if that makes sense. And the land was taken off Maori. They were forced into the bad lands, the poor lands. The best land was taken for farmers. So New Zealand, in the terms of the International Division of Labour, of producing stuff, is set up as a giant agricultural farm for Britain. So this is how, you know, industrialisation is also associated with agriculture. This is the main thing I can bring to you, coming from a very agricultural country, that to feed people who are in factories and so forth, you need lots of food. Britain could not produce enough food for itself, so it expanded. This is a very simplistic story. Took over other colonies and turned some countries into giant farms, right? So this is the main purpose of why New Zealand was set up. So we have an industrialised farming in New Zealand. It isn't small scale, like small farms. There's huge farms. And so eventually, by the 1970s, there were only 3 million people in New Zealand, but 70 million sheep. 70 So third highest in the world, and we were the biggest exporter of sheep meat, which means all forms of sheep meat like lamb and mutton, in the whole world in the 1970s. So it's actually globally important what actually went on in New Zealand. So you've got this sort of empty country, there's lots of sheep in it, huge farms. We have like sheep farms the size of small European countries in New Zealand, just one farm. So so the scale is similar to people know the Midwest of the United States, sort of huge maize.
The West of United States.
Yeah, like Nebraska. What other states are there out here? I can't think of any.
Ohio.
Yeah. So they're sort of giant farms as you see on TV, you know. So that's the broader context. Yeah. So I'll go into the meat industry. So what happened is that the meat industry, processing industry, which I'm talking about slaughterhouses. So I call them meat workers, the people who worked in there. Sometimes they're called meat packers in the United States and UK. But I just call them meat workers because that's what they do. Meat packing is just the end process, as I'll explain. So they were the most militant workers in New Zealand. They accounted for half of all strikes in the whole country. They were only 3% of the entire working population, but they accounted for almost 60% of all strikes. So they're very militant. And there was a combination of formal and informal resistance happening in meatworks and slaughterhouses. So there's only 30,000 of them working, but they're accounting for a lot of strikes. And the resistance was related to two things. The first is the 1970s context, which of course is the oil crisis, the global recession. So the end of the long boom, long period of prosperity, ends for New Zealand in the 1973 with the oil crisis, and then Britain joins the European Economic Community, European Union as it's called today, which means that New Zealand loses its guaranteed market for meat. So this immediately means New Zealand is a small trading nation and it's put into a major crisis because it's lost its export market, if that makes sense. So now it has to compete around the world. So this leads to major changes within the meat industry. Now they have to export to North America, to USA, to the whole of Europe, to Japan and so forth, right? So they're subject to international competition for the first time, and so they start to speed up production, and so on. And then the second thing that happens, so workers get annoyed with their money starts, inflation starts to rise. They start to strike a lot to get their money to keep up with inflation, their wages to keep up with inflation, as it happened all around the world, right? And so there's this sort of economic reason. The second one, major reason for resistance, is everyday working conditions. So I do want to explain this quite strongly. So if I show a slide here, if people, I don't know if people can see that, that's inside a slaughterhouse, right? So what you have here is called the chain. So that's an assembly line where an animal, after they are killed, after it is killed, is hung on a hook, and then it moves down the chain, down the assembly line, and then it is progressively what's called disassembled. So the main thing about the production process in the slaughterhouse is instead of joining together, instead of constructing, instead of assembling a car or some other product over time, you assemble it. This is disassembly line. So you have an animal, a live animal, then it's cut, it's killed, then its head's locked, cut, and then its insides are cut, so it's disassembled, right? And the skin's taken off, and then the whole animal is processed. Every part of the animal is processed. So until there's nothing more, right? That makes sense? So it's a different form of production, right? So I'll read out a quote from a New Zealand academic who's going into a slaughterhouse. And he says, "To the academic, the inside of a meatworks, a slaughterhouse, is like a premonition of hell. Machines clank, steam hisses and melts into the damp air, blood spurts and splatters across clinically white garments, animal carcasses swinging on their hooks roll slowly past, throats cut, heads hanging grotesquely, while the men sever and slash with their razor-sharp knives. So this gives you some impression of what work's like on the line. So it's very much a blood and guts nature of work. So men have sharp knives, they cut each other, and they cut themselves. Every worker cuts themselves when they're in the meatworks, in the slaughterhouse. You cannot avoid accidents. And some of these cuts are very bad. They get diseases from the animals. They pick up diseases. The work is very boring. They're doing the same task time after time, just like an assembly line. So they're the same cut, same exact cut. So to show you an example there, there's I don't know if people can see this, but down the bottom there, that guy there is called a puller, which means he pulls off the skin of the sheep, the wool. So physically, this is before automation, this is in the 1970s, he's just pulling off the skin. And that's all he does all day, right? I don't know, I can pass this around if people want. It's a bit brutal. It's very, yeah. So it's a very physical job, and also it's very precise, because workers have to be very precise in what they do, or else the carcass will be rejected for export. Yeah. And at the same time, workers are paid by the piece, by piecework. Do you have that term, Italy? Piecework?
Sì, corti, pezzi.
Yeah. So this means that the faster you work, the more you get paid, right? So workers speed up. As they speed up, they get more tired and they strike more. So there's a sort of correlation between speeding up and striking. That makes sense? Okay. Then I'll go into the different forms of informal resistance. And these are sanitized photos. I could show you much, much worse. Lots of blood. And the other thing is that the working conditions are very dangerous. So it gets very hot in the slaughterhouse. As animals are killed, they give off heat. It becomes very steamy, there's lots of water. It's very slippery on the floor. Workers can slip on the blood and the water. In summer, it goes up to 40 degrees Celsius or centigrade. Yeah. So it's very hot, very steamy, humid. And then you have these giant freezers at the end of the meatworks where they freeze the carcasses for export to Europe and North America, and they're very cold. So workers work in there putting in carcasses.
Then you have to dress properly.
But not
very properly.
Yeah, but it's like negative 30 degrees centigrade in the freezers. So it's very dangerous work, and you can see why workers resist it quite a lot, I think. So the first form of informal resistance I'm going to talk about is wildcat strikes. These were colloquially, or in New Zealand slang, called homers. So a homer, normally in American baseball, you know American baseball? You hit a home run? Mm-hmm. Homer. In New Zealand, a homer meant you go home. So to have a homer means everybody goes out, they go home. Right? That's what a wildcat strike was called colloquially. So there was an enormous number of wildcat strikes in New Zealand in the meat industry. So workers would often go on strike for just half an hour, 15 minutes, 2 hours, all the time, over any little issue. There were so many little issues that were symptomatic of wider dissatisfaction with work, right? So I think this is similar. So I should point out there are many parallels between Italy and New Zealand, between particularly auto workers, like Fiat workers, and meat workers, like New Zealand's version of auto workers were meat workers, right? So I think auto workers in Italy went on many wildcat strikes, yeah? So it's a very similar process. You know, workers just walked out over little trivial things all the time. And this was very common. So I'll read out a couple of quotes from meat workers themselves about wildcat strikes. And so this first one is from Bill Hillman, who's a Māori butcher, and he said, to quote, "In the height of the season, you had 4 chains going." So 4 chains are 4 assembly lines. you would have 58 mutton butchers on it and about 40 labourers. And the noise, and the heat, and the boys would get frustrated with it, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, bang, that's it for the day. They wanted a release, so they walk out, they go on strike. Right? So this was very common. And another quote from one of the first women mutton butchers. So women were excluded from most forms of work in the meatworks, particularly the butchers who were the highest paid. And she was one of the first ones to get a job in the 70s. And so this is a quote from a person I interviewed called Helen Mullerinen. And she said, "The wildcat walkouts were a bit of letting off steam. There wasn't hot water in the showers last night. There should be hot water in the showers. So we have a meeting and we walk off. We go home. Sometimes it was just like, oh, I feel like a day off." So this is trying to explain why so many workers went on strike. So they're walking out on many little issues. But at the same time, these little issues were symptomatic of larger issues. For example, if you do not have hot water, so you can't clean yourself, the nature of the work is very dirty and smelly. So workers are often covered in blood, they're often covered in shit, because when you're dealing with intestines, there's a lot of shit in them, right? And so they often get covered in shit and blood, and they get smelly, so it's very smelly and very dirty. It's horrible working conditions. So they want to have a shower, right, at the end of the day. So if you don't have hot water, it becomes a big issue. So even though it seems trivial, a lot of these strikes were symptomatic of larger issues about the nature of the work, right? Okay, so any questions? Am I going too fast? No? Okay, on to the second major form I'm looking at. So I'm only going to talk about 3 major forms. There are many others, because informal resistance is very, very broad. But I'm just talking about 3 main ones I came across. And the second one I came across is basically time appropriation and absenteeism and time theft, right? So the first one is what was called in New Zealand spelling, which means to take a spell from work, to take a break from work. And this is sort of like an informally organised system with workers and a work group when they're working together, say butchers, or another one is boners who cut the fine. That makes sense? Or labourers. One of them would walk off the job during work time, and the other workers would cover for them. So they just take a break, and they go and sit in the cafeteria or canteen, have a cup of coffee, whilst the other workers would do their job for them. So they sort of rotate themselves out of work, or they'd go home, do an errand, go to the library, or whatever they did, right? They had to do something in town, so they'd have other workers cover for them. So this was very common, and bosses could not do anything about it, even though they disliked it. If they tried to dismiss or fire or sack a worker, the workers will all go on strike. So this is the way these informal traditions were maintained, if that makes sense. So
it's accepted by the management.
Yeah, reluctantly, very reluctantly. But they have their comeback in the 1980s when they win, right? But in the 1970s they won't win. So workers had much more control. Yeah, even though still bosses had still lots of control. I don't want to give the impression that they were completely autonomous. Workers, they were still within the overall rhythms of capitalist production. And there were foremen down the line inspecting their job, etc. And okay, the second one is absenteeism. So people know what that is. Like you pretend that you are sick and you don't come to work at all, right? So there was a lot of long weekends, which means you take Monday or Friday off and you take a 3-day weekend for yourself. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, yeah. This was very common in the meat industry. And so to give a quote from Helen Mullerinen again, so a common joke about absenteeism in a slaughterhouse was that a foreman would say to the worker, why don't you come in on the 5th day? So why are you absent on the 5th day of work? And the response was, because I can't live on 3 days' pay. So they're basically saying, I can live on 4 days' pay, right? That's enough for me. But I can't be absent more than that. Does that make sense? So it's quite funny, I think. And then I'll move into the third main form of informal resistance in the networks, was of course theft and sabotage. So this is stealing the product rather than stealing time. And so what happened in the meatworks, I think similar to the auto factories in Italy, is that workers made work fun, because you had this very alienating work process where you were doing the same job day after day, just the same cut, cut like this. So workers want to talk to each other, of course. And this is what they did, and they had games going on at work. So you take advantage of the product in front of you to play, right? To make fun, to make this job more bearable, right? Less alienating. But in the meat factory, of course, you were going to use the animals in front of you for fun. So what they did was they flicked bits of the animal product at each other. They threw bits of animal product at each other. They threw blood. They threw shit. They threw shit at the supervisors and stuff like this. So there was quite a lot of joking going on. What else? Yeah. So I'll give an example. I'll read out a quote. So when you've got an animal carcass in front of you, you've got your liver, right? So beside your liver of any animal, there's a little gland attached to it. So what workers would do, little glands like this big, we've got thyroid glands. These little glands attached to it, so they're about this thin. They're hard, right? So they pull off the gland off the liver, and then they flick them at other workers, or at foremen, at supervisors. They flick like that, then pretend that they haven't done anything, right? So there's a bit of fun, right? So I'll read out a quote. So the livers had these little glands attached to them, and if you could pull them off, they would make good missiles. You'd just flick them with your thumb, so like that, and you could do it without anybody seeing you, and they kind of stun if they hit you. If you got one on your ear, they really wake you up. But I could never get the thing to hit the target. If I ever did hit the target, I would be so happy I could not keep a poker face, like that. So this is what they're doing. And so this sounds harmless, right? So this is just a bit of fun, right? This isn't really resistance. This is often the image of informal resistance. It's just workers have a bit of fun. So what? It's not really resistance. But this in fact was sabotage. Because what would happen was that there's these meat inspectors who would go down the production line, right? And they would inspect every carcass of sheep. And the carcass had to be perfect to be exported, right? And so if they found any defection, they would condemn the product for export. And so if they found any glands missing, no glands, the whole carcass would be rejected for export. So it was actually, these little games led to sabotage of the entire product. So a lot of product was rejected because of the sabotage. And again, sometimes workers were fired for this, what I call gamification, turning work into a game. But again, workers would go on strike if one of their fellow workers was fired, and get the worker reinstated, get their job back, right? So this is how these informal traditions were maintained. And the second major form of sabotage is of course stealing. So stealing was widespread of meat. Sometimes it's very hard to steal a whole carcass, it's pretty big, it's like half the size of us, or even 3/4 the size of us. So you can't kind of walk out the factory gate, or apparently some did under their coats, but so it was more small cuts, so little cuts of meat, and they put them in their pockets and walk out past the factory gates. But also this would happen on the job, on the factory floor, on the killing floor, it's called in a slaughterhouse. That's what the shop floor, the work floor is called, a killing floor. So what would happen is that we know workers working on the line, beside them they've got this bowl. It's called the knife sterilizer. So every time they cut a sheep or a cattle, they would have to put dip their knife into this hot water running beside them, and it was in a big bowl to sterilise, to make it hygienic, right? And so what they would do is they'd get little glands or kidneys or little bits of the sheep and cattle and put them in the knife sterilizer, and then put in the plug. So it would sit there and boil away and cook. So they'd be cooking meat in the knife sterilizer, right? Whilst they're working, right? and it'll take about an hour, and then they'll have it for morning tea. Do you have morning tea in Italy? No. It's like a break between breakfast and lunch, where you have coffee and a snack, right? So they'd eat it. They'd take it out of a knife sterilizer and eat it. But then if supervisors saw this, they'd be frothing, like boiling, right? And they'd pull out the plug. They'd try and stop it. They didn't like this, right? So again, it was sabotage, taking away, a bit away from the animal, right? So it's quite funny, I think. Should I read out a quote about that? No? Do you want to hear?
Right.
Okay, so this is from another worker about, these were called boil-ups, when you were boiling something, a boil-up in New Zealand slang, in the knife sterilizer. So they had these bowls of hot running water, and you had to dip your knife into it to clean it after each one, or something, or sometimes after every 3 sheep. It just depended on the job. But they were great for cooking out kidneys and tongues and things. So this was very common. He said there was an awful lot of this type of eating on the job, right? Because workers, they were producing huge numbers of sheep carcasses. They were industrial production, right? And they're seeing all this meat going past them, and they can't eat it. And meat actually in New Zealand is expensive because it's all being exported. So all the best meat goes to Europe, and we get the poor quality meat. So workers would steal this good quality meat. If that makes sense. So to give you some idea of the size. So this is I can pass this around, but that's a bit gory. That is gory, brutal there. You might want not look at that. But this is a freezing chamber inside of a meat slaughterhouse. So those are all carcasses of sheep, of lambs, young sheep. Right? There's 500,000 of them. 500,000, 500,000 in just one slaughterhouse. This is the size of this industrial production. That's just one slaughterhouse, right? So shall I pass that around? But don't look at that. That's gory. That's somebody pulling out intestines. So I shall get into the debate now about how to interpret this forms of resistance. But as you can see, it's pretty widespread. And at the time, of course, many academics studied this, but from a more conservative viewpoint. They weren't Marxists or socialists. They were basically concerned that there was too much resistance. They wanted to nullify resistance, to allow production to flow smoothly. And the thesis they came up with is that workers, by resisting, they were basically adapting to this really alienating work. So it's called the adaptation thesis. So you have this very alienating work process, right? Very brutal working conditions, very boring. So workers try to adapt to it, right? To cope with it. So it's a means of coping, right? To deal with it, right? So they're basically saying it's not radical at all. It's just workers just trying to cope. And they're also saying it's very individualistic, is their other major claim. The workers just do it individually, like they go home, take the day off, right? And I think, and so as you can see from some of the quotes that I quoted, sometimes workers did just want to release from work. It wasn't particularly radical at all. They were just, tired from working so hard, right? So I think there's some truth in this thesis, but I do want to challenge it. And particularly I want to challenge it on the basis that a lot of this resistance was collective or communal. It wasn't individualistic, it wasn't just one by one. And so the main forms of, so it's reflective of a wider shop floor or killing floor culture, a workers' culture they created that was collective. So there's very strong bonds of solidarity between the workers in the meatworks, similar to an auto factory, right? The workers really supported each other. It wasn't complete. I'll explain there was divisions, but it was very strong. And this was reinforced by very strong trade unions, labour unions in the meatworks. So that sort of shop floor solidarity the workers created was combined with a union solidarity. And so it was very much a collective thing. So for example, when workers took the day off, they were absent from work, they would do it together. So there's all these reports of workers going to play rugby together. So rugby is our version of football. So workers would take, during work time, would go and play rugby. They would go to the pub together, to bars together, to drink during work time. So they'd take the day off to socialise together, right? It wasn't all individual, right? And of course, wildcat strikes, by their very nature, are collective or communal. And that phenomenon of taking spells, covering for other workers whilst you have a little break, is also, I think, communal. It's collectively organised. This is not individually organised. I think it's quite strong collective. And of course, this is related in New Zealand to, I'll just bring up the slide, to a thing called workplace whānau. So whānau is a Māori word, it means family. I'll put it on the board. So, you say whānau. So 40 to 50% of meat workers were Māori. So they're the indigenous people of New Zealand. So a very high proportion, only 15% of the population were Māori. So a much higher proportion of Māori in the meat works. And when there was a large number of Māori in a particular plant, a particular factory, that often formed a workplace family or a whānau. So whānau is Māori for extended family. So it's not just your brothers and sisters and father and mother, it's your cousins, your second cousins and your third cousins, and your grandparents and your great uncles and so forth. So this is the way often Māori society is traditionally structured around the family, right? So family is a very important unit. So a workplace whānau denotes that you are going beyond sort of kin-based relations to include everybody in a particular family, right? So it's a work family. So think of it as a work family. And in Māori culture, this is reciprocal, so you have strong obligations going both ways if you're part of this family, of being supportive towards each other, right? So Māori sort of contributed to this shop floor culture of solidarity through their own culture. There's an intermingling, right? New Zealand is a racist country. It is white dominated, but in certain places Māori have been able to find spaces where they can influence things, and the meatworks was definitely one. Often when white workers went into the meatworks, they sort of were Māorified, does that make sense? They became Māori. They married Māori. There was a lot of intermarriage between meatworkers, a lot of socialising, and it was very much a multi-ethnic workplace. And not all slaughterhouses. Some slaughterhouses were white dominated. Where this did not happen, but where there was a large number of Māori, there was a strong Māori influence, and so this reinforced these bonds of solidarity. If that makes sense. Yep. So I'll read out a quote by a Māori meat worker called Hanare, which is Māori for Henry, Hanare O'Keefe. And he said the best thing about working the meatworks was the people, of course. The camaraderie was the biggest thing. We worked together, we slept together, we socialised together, and there was 2,000 of us. It was a real family, an absolute total family. So he's basically describing all 2,000 workers in just one slaughterhouse were like a family to him. They all sort of knew each other, and they built up these bonds over time. So these are also related to material conditions. It isn't just a cultural thing, because what happened was, of course, under Keynesianism, under the conditions of the long boom, everybody had work. So we had full employment in New Zealand. So over time, people could work in the same place, right? And they could build up a culture over time, from the 1950s, right, up to the 1970s, right? So this is how this culture was built up. It's very much related to material conditions, I think, as well, right? And it's much harder to form these bonds under, say, precarious, casualised conditions today, where people only work for 2 months or 1 week in one workplace and they move to another one, and then you don't know the people, you know? But these are these people working in the same place for 20, 30 years, and they're multi-generational. So you often, you know, people from the same family are working in the same plant. You know, father, daughter, son, and so on, cousins, you know, so you have this sort of family ties as well, real family ties happening over time, right? So that's an explanation of why there was so much solidarity and collectivity in the meatworks. So to re-examine the original theories of the autonomous, how are we going for time? Good?
Yeah.
Okay. To examine the autonomous theories, I think the autonomous Marxists are correct. There was a substantial refusal of work happening in the meat plants, particularly through wildcat strikes and through absenteeism. But at the same time, I don't think it was a strategy of refusal, as Tronti said. He talked about the strategy of refusal. So workers would have a strategy of refusing, right? So it's a wide sort of political strategy. This wasn't so political, right? That makes sense? There was refusal, but it wasn't tied to a wider political strategy. That makes sense? It was very much a sort of ad hoc. Does that mean? Do you have the term ad hoc? Informal, ad hoc? I can't translate. Don't worry. And also contradicting the refusal of work. There was contradictions to it. And this is that workers also worked hard. So they weren't, even though they were refusing work, they were also working very hard and long hours, right? And then they'd go on strike, right? It's because they're under piecework. So faster they work, the more they get paid, right? So they work very hard and then they need a release, right? So they weren't refusing work all the time, like the autonomous kind of wanted, right? So it was more complex than the autonomous pictured, right? And then to go into the second theory which I talked about, which was the CLR James, the Johnson-Forrest tendency, the US tendency, sort of saying that there's informal control over work. So workers would try and informally control work process on the shop floor, on the killing floor. And this did happen a lot also, I believe, in the meat industry, particularly through hiring. So workers would actually control the hiring process. So what they would do is they would say, oh, can my cousin, my friend get a job here? And if they were not hired, they would go on strike, right? So you have compulsory unionism in New Zealand at the time. Everybody was in a union. So it's a closed shop. And so you had to be in the union, a union member to get a job. And often workers would control whether you had a job or not, right? Does that make sense? So they'd go on strike if they were refused. So even though bosses did have some control over the hiring process, they didn't have absolute control. That made sense. There was also a lot of control over the work speed. So workers would often, through the unions, set the work speed on the line. They would have agreements with the bosses. Yep. And often they would informally control the work speed. Right? That makes sense? Even though there was some conflict with unions, because often the unions sometimes they're implicated in capitalism sometimes. You know what I mean? They're trying to sell a product. Does that make sense? Sometimes? So sometimes they would monitor the line. The delegates, the union shop steward, the delegate. Do you have an Italian delegati?
Sì, delegati.
Yeah.
Rappresentanti.
Yeah. So delegates would have awful lot of control over the work process. Actually, I've read a quote that would actually more control than the supervisors. But often they're actually inspecting workers to make sure that they weren't doing bad work, right? So they could form a sort of what's the term? They were supervisors themselves in a way, right? So workers sometimes rebelled against the unions. That makes sense. But often the unions were on their side. So what happened was with the wildcat strikes, to show you how it worked, workers would organise a strike and then they'd call a meeting of all workers in a plant, a union meeting, and then the union would officially endorse this unofficial strike. Does that make sense? And then everybody would go out on strike because they had a policy of what was called one out, all out. Yep. So there was a kind of a fusion there. Yeah, so and also workers had control over the space of work. And this is an important thing that sometimes I overlook. They control their own space. For example, with the cafeteria, it was a management-free zone. So they'll keep management out of the cafeteria. And if management came into the cafeteria, they'd go on strike. So they had their own space within the factory. And also they control sometimes the actual workspace and not allow management in. So you had an awful lot of informal control. But at the same time, this is not everything, because at the same time workers wanted to control work informally, they also want to escape from it, right? So they're not trying to control work all the time. Just to hell with work, go away, I want to escape. As well as, of course, there's lots of cooperation with management, right? At the same time. So it's not all resistance. Often workers are cooperating with management, they're within the broader control of management as well, right? And they're seasonal workers, so that means they work one season. So they only work 3 to 6 months a year often, right? And then they're all fired at the end of the season. So, that shows you, they weren't year-round workers, right? So they didn't have complete control. So there are limits to control, right? So I wanted to look at, informal resistance is often seen as ineffective. It doesn't do anything. You just, you flick a little gland at another worker, so what? It doesn't really change anything, right? It's harmless. It's a bit of fun. Workers are joking, laughing, or playing cards, or on the line. But so what, or they're having a cigarette. So what? And my response to that is that, yes, much resistance was harmless, and it was easily recuperated, it was easily co-opted, it was easily managed by management, right? But a lot of it wasn't. And what happened was that little informal struggles would often blossom into larger, huge strikes that went on for weeks, or into lockouts of the whole plant. So often you find these little strikes over water, not having hot water or whatever, will blossom into months-long strikes that will last, 1 month, 2 months or longer. So often these little things would blossom, right? So that's when it really did stop production. So there was a real link between the covert and the overt. Does it make sense? Not all the time, but sometimes they would just blossom. Other times they just disintegrate, didn't go anywhere. Do you know what I mean? Now, of course, what also happened is that in the meat industry in New Zealand and around the world, there was a global crisis of accumulation in the 1970s, particularly after 1973. So profits start to fall in most industries, and this happened in the meat industry. So there's a profit squeeze happening. And of course, this is related to many different factors. The oil crisis, which puts the cost of everything, producing everything up. If they put up the price of oil, it's related to the worldwide recession, to the end of the long boom, and so on and so forth. So profits start to go down, and overproduction and all those theories. But at the same time, I think there's also profits start to squeeze because of resistance. I know this is controversial, but I think workers' resistance did actually limit profit, because they're going on strike so much, and reducing production, there's not as much profit. I think it is a factor. I know it's controversial to say this. And this happened in the meat industry big time, right? Very large profit squeeze. And for example, so they shut down production often of entire lines on a Friday afternoon because most people have gone home for the day, Often this would happen on Fridays or Mondays, that they'd have to shut down an entire line of production. So it really did stop production, or they would stop stock movements. So to get the animals into a slaughterhouse, they have to put them on giant trucks, and that transport is carefully controlled. They have to get them from farms to the slaughterhouse, and they'll often have to stop these stock movements because workers were out on strike or were resisting and so forth. So there's all these reports from corporations saying our profits are going down, our production's going down because workers are going on strike all the time, and they're taking over control of our workplace and so forth. And to some extent, I think this is true. Even though this is controversial, yeah. And then, of course, if you actually look at the figures, absenteeism cost them much more lost production than strikes. So people taking the day off meant that the production went down a lot more. It's like exponentially higher. There's officially reported figures about that. That's in my article. And then, of course, I think to show the effectiveness of informal resistance, what happens in the 1980s is, of course, there's a counter-reaction. We all know what that was. It's restructuring, it's neoliberalism, you close down factories, you automate, you mechanise, you cut jobs, you speed up the work. So all these things happen in New Zealand, right? This happens all around the world, and they introduce new management methods, like lean, mean production, Toyotaism. You all heard of this? Yeah? Yeah. And so, but at the same time, what happens is they try to break up these bonds, these informal bonds on the shop floor of solidarity, right? They try and break up this solidarity through reimposing discipline on the shop floor. So this is what they actually talked about. We need to, what's the phrase? There was a famous phrase, we need to, what's basically a reimposition of discipline on the factory floor. So they sort of take back the factory floor, they take that control that workers had, and now they sort of split the workers up, they take back the power of unions, they nullify the resistance. And it was quite successful in New Zealand, unfortunately. It happened over a long period of time. So it happens from the late 1970s onwards to the 1990s. So what they do is they close about half the slaughterhouses, they shut them down. They reopen new slaughterhouses, which are highly automated, so a lot of jobs go. So that these new automated plants have half the number of workers in them, but they are working much faster, and they're producing much more. So just with half, so the workers' jobs get cut in half. So it goes from 30,000 to 18,000 by the late 1990s. They produce much more. Their wages are cut in half. So that previously, through struggle, workers were well paid in the industry. Yeah. They had gained good wages they were blue-collar workers, but they were sort of almost a labour aristocracy. They lose those wages, and now they're minimum wage, near to minimum wage or just above workers. They're not paid very well at all. And this is resisted, of course. There's many strikes. In fact, they reopen one whole factory after they close it, if we're going on a strike. So there's an awful lot of resistance over a long period of time, but over time, the solidarity and these strikes go down. So the really huge peak in the 1970s and 1980s, and then it's sort of about the mid-1980s, the strikes go down. So even though, and also what happens is that in response to struggle, farmers look to get around the struggle. Does this make sense? So it creates a, what's the word? They experiment with new products, right? You try and escape. If workers are resisting here, you go around them. So they move into the dairy industry, which is like cattle farming, producing mainly milk. My accent's terrible.
No, it's fine.
So New Zealand's now a major producer of milk around the world, dairy production. And there isn't a tradition of workers' resistance, even though there's giant dairy factories in New Zealand, which are like about 5 stories high. They're massive factories, industrialised dairy farming. So they went into dairy farming to get around this workers' resistance. So they mechanise the production, and they produce larger sheep. There's all these scientists looking at sheep breeds, and they get huge sheep. Like they've got huge cattle now. They look at new forms of grass that produce more grass. So all these, it leads to innovation for capital, right? So the 1980s leads to this wave of innovation to get around this crisis, right? And unfortunately in New Zealand, I think it was kind of largely successful because their profits started to go up from about the 1990s onwards. They're more efficient, they produce more, etc., and they get around the resistance, unfortunately. Even though there's still some resistance in the meat industry at the moment, like there's been 3 major lockouts throughout the country. Workers have been precarised, they've been turned into casualised workers. Before they all had, they were seasonal workers, but through the union they had a sort of union ticket. Sort of a seniority system, you know what I mean? They could get a job in the next season. Now they're casualised, they don't know if they have a job the next day. They don't know whether they're going to, So it's much more casualised, it's much more precarious. So unfortunately it's been one of those industries where I think capital's been quite successful, So this is when I'm talking about the cycles of struggle and crises. That there's definitely we're at a low ebb in New Zealand of resistance now, I think. Though I must say that there is a problem with my research, is that I have not really researched the current period at all. So there may be lots of still informal resistance happening that I don't know about. But from what I hear from the 1990s on, they really cracked down, they really stopped. They cracked the whip. Have you heard of that saying before? They stopped this informal resistance, and you could fire workers for this resistance, and the workers did not have the means of stopping it or going on a strike anymore to stop it. Does that make sense? So the workers talk about how the working conditions became more brutal, more sped up, more faster, very inhuman, more alienating, less time to have fun, and they could be, control of going to the toilet. All these things start to happen in the 1990s. There's sort of a disciplinarian turn associated with neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is it's the opposite. It's a disciplinarian turn, even though it's vouched in freedom. It's talking about teamwork, and you have workers in teams, autonomous teams. Not true. That just means they're more, in practice, they're more controlled. They're more sort of self-managed discipline. I think that's what happened. Yeah, that's what happened in New Zealand. I think a similar story happened in many industries around the world with restructuring. It's a sad story, but I think it should be challenged. It's maybe not all stand, maybe resistance can come back again and workers can have more freedom. I think that's really important because I think they're treated like machines now. Yeah, so what else can I say? So can I briefly just talk about contradictions? So I don't want to give the picture that there was all omnipresent, there wasn't resistance everywhere, right, in the 70s. There were contradictions. Not all workers participated, right? So many did not strike because they did not have the money, or they pulled out of strikes. They did not strike anymore because they needed the money. So that was one major contradiction. The second one is that workers were internally divided. Even though they had tremendous solidarity, they had very impressive solidarity, there was occupational division, so the workers definitely had a hierarchy, right? So at the top were the butchers. So the butchers are at the front of the line, right? And they're the ones killing and cutting the animals, right? And then you go down the line, you have labourers, you have boners who cut the fine cuts, the small cuts of thighs and legs and stuff. And then you have all these other workers working on the test irons and so forth down the line. And then the packers at the very end. And you have the freezers are the people working in the big freezing chambers. So the ones at the very top of the line they have the best pay. They're on performance pay, they're on piecework. Many of the other workers don't have piecework, right? But because this work process is interdependent, they have to work at the same speed as the butchers at the front of the line. So they get annoyed and they strike. So this leads to more resistance actually. But there's actually strikes between the workers. So some labourers who are working on the line beside the butchers, they're just cleaning up after all the blood and gore and the guts everywhere, and they have to sort of sweep it up, right, in the blood. Go on strike against the butchers sometimes. So there's actually strikes between the workers. But overall there's an awful lot of strikes where workers go out together. That makes sense. And the second major division is, of course, gender. So 95% of the workers are men. So it's a very male-dominated workforce. Progressively over time, women try and get jobs, right? But they're actually excluded from the best paid jobs. In particular, they go in at the bottom. They do often the dirtiest and smelliest work. That makes sense? So they're working with the shit intestines, cutting up intestines when sort of shit spurts on them. That's, you cut intestines. If you don't cut it the right way, that type of job. And so they're often working in the lowest paid, most horrible conditions, right? And so they try and get the better jobs as the 1970s progresses. And they're resisted by some men on the shop floor, and by the trade unions, and by the management. So all three of them kind of say, no, we don't want you to have these jobs for different reasons. For the unions, it was seen as a break of solidarity. They thought the woman would be less militant than the men. They would not be involved and want to strike as much. Often this was just a cover for male prejudice. But progressively over time, more women did get these jobs, and unions and workers slowly accepted, right? So that was a change, and then they become accepted into the workplace whānau, to the family. But often just as one of the men, right? They don't become, you know what I mean? They become one of the boys. So the culture is very macho in the workplace, in the meat industry. It's kind of a macho, hard men, have you heard that term? Tough guys. They're big guys, a lot of them, because it's very physical work. So they have a culture of lots of drinking together. So it's a very male culture, right? But then to become one of the boys, to become part of the pack, part of the crew, and what it's called in New Zealand, you have to become sort of male, right? So women, I think that's the way they became accepted on the shop floor. There weren't, I can't think of any strikes by men against women. I don't think there were strikes, but there's definitely restriction of them getting jobs, of women getting jobs. That makes sense. So it's a very complex picture. So even though there was lots of resistance, and it was huge, a huge scale, not all were involved, and there's tensions between the workers, right? It's not all workers going out together and being happy, you know, solidarity. Yeah, so I think it was very much a mixture. It's a very complex picture when you look at it like that. Yeah, so that's all I think I have to say. So yeah, I think my main conclusion is basically that informal resistance needs to be studied. So to relate it to, you guys are going to be looking at a global history, right, as part of your course. Global history, right? And I think it's important to, first of all, look at parts of the globe, like New Zealand, which are far away. Not just to look at China or India. There's other countries out there, right? To look at the global system of trade and how it's all interdependent, right? So remember that New Zealand's exporting food on an industrial level to workers in North America and Europe to feed them, right? So it enables other, so it's a global system of trade. And I think agriculture needs to be included, because often when we think of work and labour, we think of factory workers, who are mainly men, of course, giant plants, but there's also industrialised agriculture happening in the world. Not all agriculture is small peasant farmers, right? A lot of it is highly industrialised, and it's on a very Forder scale, a Forder production line scale. And I think that needs to be included in the global picture. And also I think it's important to look at indigenous labour on a global scale, because indigenous people often come from different traditions, and there's often an intermixture between more European traditions, like the majority of New Zealand is European, of European descent like me, but a lot are Polynesian. And there's different cultures that play, different conceptions of time, different conceptions of, Māori were only colonised 150 years ago. It wasn't long ago, and they still have retained many of the traditions, right? They haven't been sort of Europeanised, right? So they're bringing in different cultures into the workplace. So it's important to look at that, even though it's very hard to tell the influence. I think that's important when you look at work globally. In South America, there's a strong indigenous influence. And the intermixture of ethnicity is really important in the workplace, in the global workplace. In New Zealand, it's very similar to Italy. We have an internal labour migration of Māori from rural areas to the cities. It's very similar to southern Italians going to the north to work in the factories. This is what happened to Māori in the 1950s and 1960s, right? And then they start to rebel, just like many southerners. Not all southerners, but they go into Fiat and Turin or wherever, and they start to rebel, right? Māori are similar. They don't initially rebel, but a lot do. And then also tied into other global processes, there's a large amount of protest in the world in the 1970s. So the workplace is not cut off from the rest of society. We've got to look at the workplace in context, yeah? And so there's a large amount of protest about the Vietnam War in New Zealand and the rest of the world, and this sparks a whole wave of extra parliamentary protest, right? Social movements. So you've got women's liberation, you've got black liberation, You've got the rise of ecological consciousness. You've got a huge amount of anti-racism, particularly around apartheid in South Africa, which is global, right? And this all influences New Zealand and the rest of the world, right? And it flows into protest in the factory floor. I think there are many links that we should make. So there's protest as a global thing, having the waves, and so at the same time, Māori are going on strike in factories. There's a huge movement of Māori resisting colonisation in New Zealand in the 1970s against land alienation. So Māori, by this time, had lost 95% of all their land. Originally, they all owned the whole country, so they just have 5% left, right? And they start to protest and they start to occupy land, physically occupy land, to try and get land back. So it's associated. So there's an uprising, right? And outside society and inside it, and there's a linking of the two, right? And by the 80s, this starts to be repressed, right? So there's also, so this is the sort of cycles of history, right? There's a lot of protest, and I think that's really important to look at globally, those sort of waves, they sort of ripple around the world, I think you guys know all about that in Italy. This happened, I think, in Italy. So I think that's all I want to say. So thank you.